Hello and welcome to Grief School with Julia Samuel, part of a series of talks and conversations for the National Day of Reflection. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you, Julia, for being here. My name is Lucy Selman. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the University of Bristol and the founder of Good Grief Festival. My research specialises in palliative and end-of-life care and bereavement, and I'm really delighted to be leading with my colleague Emily Harrop at Cardiff University a national study exploring experiences of bereavement during the pandemic. I'm really happy to be joined today by Julia Samuel, one of the leading psychotherapists in the UK. She was awarded an MBE in 2015 for her services to bereaved children. She is founder patron of Child Bereavement UK and vice president of the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy. Julia has also authored 2 best-selling books, Grief Works and This Too Shall Pass. At this time of collective loss, talking about grief and mourning and how we can cope with these often difficult experiences seems more important than ever. And in this session, we'll talk about what grief is, why it's been particularly hard over the past year, and practical tips to support ourselves and each other when we're grieving. The session's divided into 2 halves. So first, Julia and I will speak for about half an hour, followed by half an hour of taking questions from all of you. So please do use the chat box on the right-hand side of the screen to enter in your questions for Julia, and they'll come through to me. We might not be able to deal with all of your questions today, but we really appreciate you taking the time. So, Julia, it's so lovely to see you.
Lovely to see you. And I don't know if people watching now were part of the national reflection earlier, and that felt so poignant and moving that we really need to come together in that way and bear witness to these multiple losses that thousands, hundreds of thousands of people have experienced, and name the loss and acknowledge it, and then turn to hope. And it just felt so powerful to be able to do that, even when we're remote and distant from each other, that we could come together in that way. It felt such an important point.
Yes, yeah, certainly. And I think we've all had to learn in the last year how to continue to reach out and come together despite the social distancing and all of the restrictions that we've been living through. So, yeah, thank you to everyone who took part in that. My first question today, Julia, is what is grief? So we're starting with a big one. So what is grief and what is its purpose?
Well, grief, it's such a tiny word that describes a messy, chaotic, contradictory process. And every individual experiences it as differently on the inside as they look on the outside. It is uniquely personal and different. And yet, the purpose of it is to find a way of adapting to this new reality, to the death of the person that was very significant to you and you loved, who has died. And that is a painful ebb and flow process, which can be more complicated or less complicated. But the thing that matters is getting the love and support at the time of the grief. That's the most significant support for your outcome, is that when someone dies, that we need love and connection to others. Grief itself is the emotional reaction to the loss, and mourning is that process we go through to adjust to that reality. And that has lots of different aspects to it. There's what I call the paradox of grief, the battle between not wanting to face the reality of it and having to face the reality of it. And that process, pain is the agent of change. Pain is the thing we most don't want to feel, but is the thing that forces us to face that reality, because incrementally, every time we have a kind of hit of loss, it tells us again the person that we love has died. And as we do that and find a way of expressing our grief, we incrementally adjust. And it's a sort of ebb and flow process that you move in and you move out of. And over time, longer than anyone wants, people do learn to live with the loss and accommodate the loss. And in some ways, that word accommodation is important, because at the beginning process of loss, it's like everything is the grief, that's all there is. And if you get the support and allow yourself to adjust and process to this new reality, you build your life around the loss. The level of the loss doesn't change, but the intensity of it does change. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, thank you. And I wondered if you also wanted to reflect on this idea of collective grief and what it's like when so many of us have experienced losses over the past year.
Collective grief is, I think, where all of us are experiencing these multiple losses, and it can feel very overwhelming. All the losses of the death, but also living losses, people losing their jobs, economic insecurity, structural kind of shifts and systems changing. So it requires, some of which we've been doing today, to acknowledge this community loss and to have time to reflect, that we need to have time for communally psychological repair, and that we need to come together as a community to do that. We need to connect and reach into each other. And often the powerlessness of collective loss feels too much. And I think in reality that is because it is too much. So that our reaction to it is we need to kind of go very slowly. And I think one of the ways I think about collective loss, it's like there's so much that's entangled in a very messy room that it's a sort of jumble that you can't make any sense of, and you don't know where to start. And, you know, what I talk to with clients is that you focus on one small thing, like one aspect of it for you, and take your time and allow yourself to kind of disentangle that and begin to make sense of it. Because a big part of grieving is also finding meaning. It's believing that life has meaning is an incredibly significant part, and helps our adaptation in grieving is if we can find meaning through it. And I think we need to find individual meaning, but also collective meaning in what has happened to all of us around the world, as well as in the UK.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. And you've said in the past, and you've touched on this just now in terms of the communal nature of grief and sort of moving through grief, how important it is to have that connection to others. You've said the path to rebuilding trust in life after a loss is paved with other people. And I think that really touches on one of the most difficult aspects of grieving at this time. So in the last year, people have obviously having to deal with their loss and cope with their bereavements in these really challenging circumstances of lockdown and social distancing. And our research studies documenting, of course, some of these challenges. And I just wanted to flag some of the results that are emerging from our study. So we've analysed the first 500 responses to a national survey of people bereaved since the 16th of March last year. And we found that over 2/3 of people were unable to say goodbye to their loved one as they would have wished to do so before the death. And over half had been unable to visit them before the death. More than 2/3 had experienced social isolation and loneliness, with lockdown and social distancing restrictions disrupting the emotional support they needed from family and friends. And over 90%, of course, also reported restricted funerals. And I just wondered if you could reflect on some of those findings from a therapist's perspective. You know, what impact might that have in terms of how people grieve at this time?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised, and I kind of can feel the sadness and the intensity of that as you were saying it. That, you know, not being able to be with someone when they die, not being able to hold their hand and be present and have the opportunity to say goodbye is, you know, an added loss. Not to have a funeral, not to have the kind of funeral and the rituals. You know, grief throws you into an alien territory, and rituals give us these kind of pillars of familiarity, of people coming together, connection and hugs, and how we have funerals and ways of saying goodbye that kind of hold us steady. And the one of the biggest derailers of grief is all the what ifs, all the things that you wish you could have said or have done. And so, you know, from what you said, it matches what I hear from people. I think their grief will be much more complex. It's one of the ways I kind of think about it. It's like normal grief, but with the volume turned up. So it's much more likely to be traumatic. It's much more likely to be complex. It's much more likely to be prolonged. I think a lot of the people I've been talking to so that it feels like it's surreal, that they're kind of in limbo. They don't feel like they've started their grieving process. And of course, trauma isn't adaptive. So trauma blocks your natural grieving process. So that would need to be addressed before people can begin to process their grief. And, you know, one of the biggest things we understand about grief, which has very much been a sort of central part of today, is that when someone dies, the love doesn't die, the relationship continues, and that it's the love and connection to the person that's died that we kind of take forward with us and having touchstones to memory. But what you've described is that many of those fundamental touchstones of memory that people need to support themselves have been taken away. So it feels very fragmented, even from the beginning, you know, at the time of the death and after the death, directly after the death, which is, you know, very complex and difficult. And I feel so much compassion for everybody. I mean, I really, really do.
Thank you. And obviously, one of the aims of this session today is to consider coping and how, in particular, people who have been bereaved during this past year can try to accommodate that loss in such difficult circumstances. And obviously, when we talk about coping, I don't mean to mention it in a sort of trite way. You know, there is no kind of getting over grief. There's no getting over. Yeah, there's no fixing it. Yeah. But I wonder if you could reflect on that, sort of, you know, what does coping with grief even really look like? You know, can we grieve well?
I think the first step is an awareness of how painful it is. And I think often people kind of turn on themselves and kind of attack themselves or criticize themselves because they feel like they're not coping or they feel like they're going mad. And what I'd like people to know is to acknowledge that grief does feel like you're going mad, that as difficult as it is, what they're feeling is normal. And so one of the big things is to acknowledge it and to turn them to themselves with self-compassion, to be kind to themselves and actively do things that support themselves rather than kind of get into a kind of rumination where they're not coping and they've got to get better at it. And, you know, that's the paradox, is that the more you support yourself to accept what you find unacceptable, the more likely it is that change will occur. So that if you can support yourself with what you find unbearable, then you do, you know, accommodate it and adapt. And I think we need to find ways of expressing our grief. And that, again, will be very individual, I think, collectively, as we've done today, but also individually. So that may be journaling, it may be wearing something significant of the person that's died, it may be cooking, it may be gardening, and most commonly it's talking. I mean, I think a lot of people do find, you know, finding the words for what they're feeling, that feeling cohate in their body and kind of voicing them and them being heard really makes a difference. But journaling would work as well for that. And I think the big thing is that we need to find a way of being listened to, of everybody's stories. We need to have an understanding, a narrative of what has happened, a coherent narrative that we can make sense of for ourselves, or even find ways of the things that we can't make sense of. You know, every piece of the jigsaw where there's a piece of the puzzle missing can drive us mad. So we need to get as much information as we can, and through talking and being close to other people who we feel we trust and love, that listen to us, we find a way, by going over and over the story, of having a story that we can learn to live with, and we can sort of not have it kind of dig into us. There are lots of feelings that come up, that we become the version of ourselves that we don't want to be. And I think that's something else that we need to have self-compassion for. So people become angry or bitter or resentful. And of course they do, because it's so painful. Or if their partner has died and they see a couple walking down the street, you get this stab of jealousy. So grief, as Tyrone Lewis said this morning, it's a very unwelcome visitor in your life. It shows you versions of yourself that you would much rather not have. But in a way, it's sort of meeting those versions of ourselves with compassion and kind of going, oh, there's that jealousy, or there's that bitterness, and allowing it and going, God, poor me, that really hurts, rather than kind of you know, the first arrow is the loss. The other one is when you stab yourself with it, that you turn against yourself. And I think that can be very, you know, delay your grief or harm you. I think one of the things that bothers me most is the numbers of people who've been bereaved are the elderly population, who are the least likely to be able to get the support that they need most. They're least likely to be able to use computers, be online, have less friends, less mobile to be able to be in their community. And those are the people I think we need to kind of really reach out to intentionally and find ways of supporting them, because they're, you know, they're not really helping themselves so much.
That chaos, I think you described that so well, the sort of chaos of grief. And I think sometimes perhaps if you haven't been bereaved yourself and then you experience a sudden loss, or you see someone close to you going through a bereavement, that chaos can be so frightening, can't it? And it can make people almost feel like they're going mad, I think.
I mean, grief really feels like fear. And sometimes it feels like fear and madness together. And, you know, when you read about grief, it's sort of put into sort of, you know, you feel sad, or you feel kind of in denial, or you feel angry. But often you have all of those feelings all at the same time, kind of roaring in your system, and you know you're not in control of it. That is why it's this unwelcome visitor. And, you know, the thing that I kind of worked with in the last 3 decades is that the things that we do to block, which of course we'd want, who wants to feel mad? Who wants to feel that they've been thrown into this hideous alien planet that they never chose to be on? But actually, it's the things that you do to block that pain that in the end do you harm. And the most common things that we do, particularly in the 21st century, is busyness, like is an anesthetic, like being super, super busy, or the other ones like alcohol or drugs, or anything that blocks the natural process of it coming through our system and having its cycle and allowing it to come, you know, to have its natural resolution. And that's, you know, that's when you're more likely to have complex grieving. But it is so tough, you know. And it's invisible. That's the other thing, you know, people often talk about, when I broke my leg, everyone could see that I was limping. But I go in the supermarket and I've left my purse behind and I haven't got my list, and I burst into tears and no one knows why, you know, because I'm grieving. And inside, I've got many limbs missing, but nobody can see it. And I look the same on the outside, and people keep telling me I'm doing so well and well done me. And that feels like madness as well, when what your internal version of yourself, your internal experience of yourself, is so different from what is seen on the outside. And from society, we want people to be okay because we care about them. But in wanting them to be okay can feel like a social pressure that you have to put on this mask when you go out. And that can, you know, be extremely hard.
Yeah, and given that there is that social pressure sometimes, and I think the bereaved often, you know, we protect other people from our own emotions, don't we? We sort of think, well, you know, I don't want that person to feel awkward, so I will put on a brave face. And so we sort of hide behind this mask of being okay, of perhaps coming across as stronger than we are. And then I was also really touched by what you said around busyness and how we use in our society busyness to kind of cover up our emotions sometimes. I was wondering if there's anyone watching who kind of recognises themselves in that, who recognises, you know, the scrolling through your phone, or, you know, being busy, or distracting yourself, or self-medicating. You know, if you recognise yourself in that, is there anything, you know, what would you recommend people do to sort of try and overcome that kind of pushing away of difficult emotion?
I mean, I think the most helpful thing is to recognise, you know, what Strobe and Shute, the theorist, talked about, loss orientation and restoration orientation, so that you oscillate. It's the movement between the adaptation process of adjusting to the loss, is the oscillation between loss orientation, where you emote and feel the pain and grieve and do all those things we've been talking about, and restoration orientation, where you have a break from the grief, you get on with your day, you think about your future, you do intentionally do things to distract you. And of course, we're not in charge of our grieving process, but I think if we develop a kind of structure that gives space for grieving, that you put a time in your day where you remember the person that's died, you talk to someone about them, you name what you're missing, you allow yourself to feel the pain, you maybe have a memory box that you add things to or you look at. And then you give yourself some self-compassion, you intentionally do things that soothe you, maybe going for a walk, it may be coming back and having a cup of tea. And then you turn your attention to getting tasks done, to kind of doing things that distract you or that you like doing. Then you can manage these waves that come at you. And I think at the beginning that probably isn't hospital isn't possible because you feel overwhelmed. But grief is adaptive. I think the phrase, time is a healer is a very annoying kind of patronizing expression because, grief lives with us. We're changed by it and it changes us as we go through life, as our relationship with the person that's died has changed. But if we support ourselves in it, it is adaptive and it does change with us. Is that saying two things at the same time, or does it make sense?
I think that does make sense. I think, if we can be compassionate to ourselves when we need to do the distracting behaviour, but at the same time recognise that ultimately we do also, as you said, also need to then oscillate and move back into the being with our loss. I think if we can try and do both things and be compassionate to ourselves along the way, then hopefully that will help with the really difficult stages, at least of the early grief experience. So thank you.
And I think this idea of, my parents' generation were very much, forget and move on. What you don't think or talk about isn't going to hurt you. And they were of the generation who'd fought in the Second World War. Their parents had survived the First World War, and they didn't have the luxury in a way to grieve. They had no choice but to get on and move on. And, when you were talking about, social expectations, I sort of think there is a place for having a stiff upper lip, that if you can, when you're going out in the world, there are people that you choose to tell your deepest, most personal version of yourself and where your pain is and express it to them. And that's probably very few. And then there's going out in the world and people ask you how you are, and you actually want to say I'm okay or I'm fine because you don't want to go into it. You don't want to be in it all the time. But the thing that needs to be understood is, the people, your friends and family, ask you what you need and allow it so that people don't make assumptions. I think people often think, well, I'm not going to talk about it because I don't want to upset them. And that is very upsetting because it's as if you can forget the person that's died when they're kind of in you in the front of your mind, every moment of the day. They're your first thought, they're your last thought. But I think what can happen within families is that even with the people closest to us, we, as you say, talk about, we want to protect them from our pain because we don't want to upset them. And I think in families, that is unhelpful. That in families, we need to find ways of having really open and honest and expressive and emotional conversations about how we're all feeling. And every member in a family is likely to feel it and express it and show it differently. But and those families that have open communication and find ways of being together openly and differently, they do much better. But in families where, say, the parents want to protect their children, then there are walls of those protection that then everyone feels more lonely and isolated, and everyone's in their little rooms, feeling sad and kind of incredibly isolated. And so it is the people closest to us that we need to tell most to. I mean, not all the time, but I think often there is a confusion about protection and putting on having a stiff upper lip. I don't think stiff upper lip per se is a bad thing. It's where we have it that matters.
Because actually, when you go out into the world and you have had almost that layer of skin removed when you're kind of newly bereaved.
It's like a raw.
Yeah, and it's so important, isn't it, that you do have that choice. You can react to someone else's questions in the way that will suit you, and you don't need to be thinking, what's going to make this person feel most comfortable. And sometimes you will want to say what's happened to you, and sometimes you won't. And actually, that's your choice, isn't it?
And I think I think maybe one of the kind of unexpected consequences of this terrible year is that people are talking about mortality more openly. I think there have been more conversations within families and within offices and in society about death. And to me, that has, really matters. And that the more sort of psychological education that we find ways of talking about these unspeakable subjects and actually voicing them, then the less stigma they have, and the more agency and connection people feel with them, so that they can get their individual needs met. So maybe with an office, for instance, your manager or your boss talking to you about what do you want your colleagues to know, do you want them to talk about it, do you want them to know about the circumstances of the death, so that you're included and are part of your healing process with the organizations you work with, rather than things being done to you, because you feel so powerless when you're grieving already, and anything that adds to that powerlessness is very unhelpful.
And you mentioned a little bit earlier around all the older people who were grieving at this time. And of course, given social distancing and the fact that we haven't been able to mix with our family members as we usually would, and many of those older people might feel, less comfortable using technology, talking to their families on Zoom. Obviously not all, but some may well do. I wonder if you have any advice for older people going through grief at this time, or conversely, people with family members who are older and who are bereaved, who might not be asking for support in the usual way.
I mean, the thing I was thinking about was sort of compassionate communities. I mean, older people are less likely to seek counselling, for instance. It's not true for everybody, but they're less likely to go to Curie or Cruise for support, because, the culture is changing, and their education was that you sort of do get on with it. So the thing I was thinking that I think would help most is social prescriptions, is the connection within the community, maybe joining a gardening club or art clubs or craft clubs, or, there are men's sheds where men who bereave can come together. So coming together with tasks where you have a cup of tea, you have company, it's there every week, you can go there, when you want, you don't kind of feel like you're asking for help, so you don't feel like you're showing yourself to be weak. And GPs are more and more offering social prescriptions, but I think it got stymied by the pandemic because everything went COVID related, and so those things disappeared. And I hope, a big pathway of collective mourning will be increasing social prescriptions and community activities of young and old coming together, of, all the different ways that we can share and be human together, because I think that is what matters to us most.
Yes, I agree. And actually, today, the National Day of Reflection, this is a great time to start reaching out to the people in our communities, our neighbours, more distant friends or acquaintances who we know have been bereaved or have had really difficult years, isn't it? And we can all play a part in that.
I think we can all play a part. And the beginning of lockdown, there was this kind of blitz spirit where community groups came together and they dropped on neighbours' doors and, obviously clapped for the NHS. And that was an amazing thing. And then I think we all got so worn down by being locked down and not having social connection. Everyone had less and less energy. But I hope as we unlock, there'll be an equal kind of burst of growth, and whatever the reverse of blitz spirit is, renewal, regeneration, where people will want to knock on their neighbours' doors, where they will want to offer them to come and sit in their gardens with them on a Saturday afternoon, have a cup of tea, or take them out to listen to music together somewhere, so that people are more connected. But I think the younger generations will have to be the proactive ones to meet the older generations.
Yeah, thank you. And we're going to move on to some questions from the audience now. We've had lots of questions come in. And the first question actually relates to the point you were just making about the next generation. So this person writes, so many people who've died during the pandemic, and there are daily tallies of the numbers of deaths on the news. Yet so often as a Western society, we avoid talking about the grief we experience. How do you think this might have had an impact on how children and the next generation will have ongoing conversations about death, loss, mourning and grief?
I mean, I think that's really interesting. I mean, I think the younger generation is already much more emotionally open and honest and sort of emotionally intelligent and more likely to talk about how they feel. You know, children learn to grieve and learn about death from the adults around them. So it will very much depend on how open their parents have been and how they've modeled talking about the pandemic. But what we know is that children need the truth, the same truth as the adults around them. So what I would hope that would happen is that there've been very truthful and often difficult conversations with families, so that we do find ways of talking about death and take, you know, in a way, talking about what we find most frightening takes the fear out of it, paradoxically. Because there is a kind of magical thinking in society, you know, that if I talk about death, that somehow it will make it happen. And when we actually have the conversation, when we find the sky hasn't fallen in, that no one has dropped down dead, but actually you now have more information. So I think lots of kind of middle-aged people have talked to their parents about their funeral. What would they want? What did, you know, and ethical wills, like what do they want to be remembered for, as well as the sort of other kinds of wills. So I hope that that spreads through the generations and takes hold as a new way of being, and in relation to death, that it's something that we need to have as much knowledge around death as we do life. We need to examine death as much as we do birth. And I think, you know, as we heard from Tyrone Lewis and many of the people this morning, when you recognize death and that we're all going to die, you actually seize the day and are more grateful for the day that you have, and life feels much more precious.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's such an important point, because those conversations about basically what matters most to us in our lives, and, you know, then also considering what might matter most to us if we did become seriously ill, or you know, eventually, you know, as you said, we're all going to die. So if we can think about that, you know, upstream, while we might still be feeling relatively healthy, then that's can only be a positive in the long run, really. So thank you for those reflections. My next question is from another audience member. So grief and loss seem to have come along in many guises during this year: loss of our jobs, our loved ones, our homes and hope. How do we hold on to our resilience as we face such loss with increased frequency in our working and personal lives, especially for people working in the helping professions?
I mean, I think that's true. So what I call those losses is living losses, and their experience like grief from death. It's like grief that you feel the same pain and powerlessness and fear and sadness and fury, and that needs to be acknowledged. And I think the thing that gives us hope, you know, hope is a feeling, but it isn't just a feeling. It is an attitude and a way of being that we need to, I think, acknowledge the loss, like look at the dark and name it, and then turn intentionally to the light with hope. And that hope is a feeling, and then it's also a plan, with a plan A and a plan B, with the belief that you can make it happen. So it needs to be a kind of realistic hope, not one, you know, that is never going to happen, but a small realistic hope. In some ways, maybe lots of micro hopes do build on that small flame, and hope is the alchemy that turns a life around. I think we feel full of despair unless we have even a small flame of hope. So, but it is intentional, and it has to come from within us. We have to kind of have an attitude towards it, and think about it, and maybe talk to other people, and maybe the other part of it is to have small hopes that are manageable for your day. That, for instance, you can have a really nice cup of coffee, a small hope that you can be grateful for today, and then a sort of longer term hope that you can look towards and look for. So keep your skylines very short, but also manageable in the distance.
Thank you. Wise words there, Julia. I've got
I always think of all the other things I didn't say afterwards, but anyhow, this is what's come out the top of my head right now.
No, I think that's brilliant advice for all of us. I've got a few comments here from people who've experienced recent bereavements. So first of all, this person says, any advice would be appreciated to get me through this horrendous time. It's just coming in waves. My husband passed away from cancer on the 26th of December 2020. I just feel I'm going round in circles and not getting anywhere.
I'm so sorry that your husband died, and you know that grief does come in waves and it completely knocks you for six. And I think the thing that why you're feeling like you're in circles is that you're at the very beginning of it, where it's the kind of shock. And I think being in lockdown has made that more difficult, that you haven't been able to probably to talk to friends. I think one of the things that helps most is walking and talking, like being out and with friends and talking about your husband and what has happened and what you feel. And that helps you kind of process it and feel less stuck with it in yourself. So that, you know, there are definitely things that support you in grief. You know, the first one, as I talked about before, is to kind of turn to yourself with compassion, and be kind to yourself and intentionally do things. Kind of look for yourself, what are the things that calm me down? Is it listening to music? Is it doing something some breathing meditation? Is it yoga? Is it talking to a friend? Is it playing with my dog? Is it cooking things? So choose to do things that intentionally soothe you. Choose to do things that find ways of remembering your husband and expressing your grief and moving between the two, like I talked about earlier. But also to move your body. You know, grief feels like fear in our bodies, and our bodies go into fight or flight and freeze. They're on hyper alert. So, I mean, one of the best things is a very simple one, is like go outside every day, whatever the weather, for maybe half an hour. And you will, however much you're dreading it, you will feel a bit better when you come back inside. But also I'd think about journaling, and memorial. You know, I remember someone saying to me, heaven is being a memory to others. Like, how can you find a heaven in the memory of your husband? What can you have in your house that memorializes him and allows you to feel close to him, touchstones to memory? Do you light a candle for him in the evenings? Have you find poems that give you solace? And the biggest one is talking to others. I mean, I hope you have a close group of friends or family that you can talk to. And I hope soon you'll be able to see people who can hug you, because I do think we're desperately touch hungry. And I think with grief, you know, a hug really makes a visceral difference. And we know from research, Lucy will know about this more than me, that a hug lowers your heart rate, and calms you and takes a lot of the fear out of your body, because you feel so alone when you're kind of frightened and on edge like that. But a hug can really help you feel safe. And safety is what we're looking for with grieving, to allow you to bear the pain of it, because it feels so exposing and frightening on your own.
Thank you, Julia. I've got two questions here which touch on the subject of guilt, and I know that you're going to be doing a session on guilt at the festival at the weekend. So first of all, someone's saying, my dad died in January this year. I feel like I never got to make him proud of me. There is so much guilt I have for things I did or didn't say or do. I just can't seem to get past. And someone else commenting, I feel guilt that I didn't recognise that my husband was having a heart attack. I relive it over and over.
I mean, they're both different guilts, aren't they? But they both come from that position of what if and regret. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross said, guilt is the most painful companion to grief. And so guilt is very normal in grief. But also guilt is an extension of our relationship with the person that's died. So with the young man whose father has died, like the sort of the guilt that you feel like you weren't the son that you wanted him to be, and maybe that in some way kind of reflects the brutality of his death. His life was cut short, and that's part of where the guilt comes from, is that you now no longer have the opportunities to be the man that you wanted to be for your dad. And I think one of the ways when I'm working with people who feel guilty, it isn't to try and persuade them to not feel guilty, but to kind of hold both the feeling that they have in their heart, the feeling of guilt that they have, and also the kind of what they think in their mind of what they kind of know to be true. And maybe there's a much bigger version of you with your dad than you fully realize. And maybe you need to talk to other people to get their input about how your dad saw you and build that into your understanding of your relationship with your dad, and that to hold the two side by side. But also, again, I mean, I keep saying the same thing, is to kind of be self-compassionate, not attack yourself, but allow yourself to feel the sadness of the loss of the opportunity that you have for the future with your dad. And the woman whose husband very sadly died of a heart attack, I think some of that guilt is recognizing our powerlessness, that fundamentally we don't have control over the people that we love who live or die in our life. But somehow we have, again, a magical thinking is that if I love them enough, I would have been able to save them, that I would have called the ambulance earlier. And I think part of the paradox of grieving is recognizing and coming to terms with our powerlessness, of what we don't have control over what we can't change, what we have to find a way of living with. And that is a painful process, but it is part of the accommodation of kind of surrendering to aspects of life and death that we can't change and that we have to learn to come to terms with. And that takes a long time.
Thank you, Julia, for those reflections. There's a question here which I think is a very important one, because it's about how we support people around us in their grief. So this person says, a friend's adult daughter passed away 5 years ago, and my friend still won't leave her home. She's a recluse. How can I help her?
I mean, that does sound like it's complex grief, that if she's a recluse and she's not come out at all. So I think she really does need support. I don't know what her friend has done already, but in some senses, what I would think about, and I don't know if this is right, I mean, I don't know what other therapists would say, but maybe she needs to do a kind of intervention with other close people to her friend, that they come in and lovingly and as warmly as they can, they need to kind of challenge her friend and tell her, we're really worried about you. This is not okay living like this. We need you to really get the support that you need. And we do it because we care about you and we want you to be okay. I mean, I think when people get stuck in their grief, one of the things that often hooks people to be stuck is that they are showing to the person that's died that they see in heaven or wherever they believe them to be watching them, and that they need to show the person that's died that they're suffering. And in demonstrating their suffering by how they're living their life, they are demonstrating their level of love for them. Like, I'm not going to have any joy in my life. I'm not going to have any love in my life. I'm not going to have any pleasure in my life to show to you that my life is nothing without you. And I really get that. And anyone who's grieving really gets that. But it's the dual process. You can own that and also own for yourself that grief invites us to love more and to engage with life more, to appreciate the preciousness of life more, and that we need to do both, acknowledge and feel the pain and know it and feel it, and to live. And that we are not, I don't want to counter what someone says or feels about themselves, but in some ways to support themselves to have the love and connection in their life, to love more, to engage with life more. And so I guess that's the intervention I'd want their friends to do. And, you know, somebody else might have a much better response to that. I don't know.
Thanks, Julia. And that actually relates to another question, which was, can you get stuck in grieving as it becomes the most comfortable and safe place to be? I think in your answer just now, you've touched on why somebody might feel like it's the safest, most comfortable place, because they feel that that's what they owe to the person who's died, perhaps.
You can, and also the less you do, the more you have these very kind of despairing patterns of behavior. Internally, our systems sink, and there's less and less emotional availability to kind of force yourself to go out, to go and see friends, to have connection with others. It's a kind of super negative spiral that people can get into. And the further they go down in it, it's like being at the bottom of the well. It's harder to climb up without the well. So, you know, one of my big kind of things this year is that with mental health, and grief is very much, you know, part of mental health, and why people suffer mental illness, is that people are talking about mental health more, but actually actively getting the support that they need and seeking mental health, you know, counselling like BACP, where I'm a vice president of, is still, people are still, I think, feel that there's a stigma of actually getting the help. So there's a barrier. There's one thing of naming I feel sad or I feel depressed or I feel low, but actively seeking help, people, I think there's a barrier to. And the longer you don't seek help, the more harm you do to yourself. So what I'm kind of taking a very long way of saying is, the earlier the intervention, the earlier someone accesses the support from Marie Curie or Cruise or anywhere else, the more likely it is that they will find a way of living again, loving again, and engaging with their life. Don't leave it until you are literally on the floor, not coping at all.
And that seems especially important at the moment, because we know there have been some communities which have really been disproportionately affected. So minority ethnic communities, but also people with other disabilities. I wonder, you know, as a researcher, I'm really aware that there are barriers to people accessing bereavement support and counselling, and not everyone does feel comfortable asking for help from formal services. How would you... I suppose I'm kind of, as I'm asking the question, I'm thinking, okay, maybe one of the solutions is that people need to realise what support is out there, and that there's actually a lot of very easily accessible web-based support, for example, or phone-based support. Because I think it can be really confronting for people, can't it, to think that they might have to sit in a room with somebody and talk really openly about something so painful.
I mean, I completely agree. And I think one of the other big surprises, not surprises, but, you know, the use of online counselling and support, whether it's text, you don't have to see someone. There's plenty of, you know, like Shout has online support, Samaritans has telephone support, that you can. The thing about online support is that you can stay at home, you can be in your bedroom at 4 a.m, not sleeping, and you can access support. And so, I mean, that is the big thing that's changed in the last 10 years, is that people's reach to get support is enormously expanded. And, but the problem is, for older people, they don't always have the technology to enable them to do it. Does that answer your question?
Yes, so it's really about, I suppose all of us can play a role in raising awareness of the support that is out there, where people can turn to get support if they feel like they need more professional support. But also all of us can play a role in reaching out to our neighbours and friends, can't we?
I think playing a role in reaching out to our neighbours and friends, but also with some of my friends, sometimes in the past, I'd sit down with them and I'd give them a number, and I'd make them, you know, I'd push a bit harder. And you know, for some people that's really annoying and they won't listen, because it's like being asked, how are you? The minute someone asks, how are you? You go away, I'm fine. And if someone like me is telling you, I really want you to get help, it's like, go away, I'm not going to get help. But if I can find a way of doing it where I'm not too pushy, but can feel loving and support them to enable them to get the help they need, that might be just the one extra lift they need to do it for themselves. That, you know, we need other people to help us to do the best thing for ourselves, because we don't always, by actually a long stretch, we often are better to others and our friends than we are to ourselves. So sometimes we need our friends to help us to be our best selves.
Thank you. I'd like to go back to the questions. We've had some really moving experiences described in the chat. So someone saying here, my 27-year-old daughter took her life in Vancouver 15 months ago. I find it's actually getting harder as the weeks go by, as the reality hits. Is this normal?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Suicide is such a devastating loss, and for your daughter, so it's a death out of time. That is an enormous tragedy and trauma. And I'm afraid in some ways that you're beginning to really feel the intensity of the pain now is in an abnormal way normal, because I think the numbness, the shock from death is greater. The greater the unexpectedness, and the greater the sort of how it should never be. And death by suicide, you know, has so many particular qualities of, you know, all of those what ifs and powerlessness and shame, and it's a taboo. So I really hope you're getting the support you need. One of the things that when I work with people who are bereaved by suicide, one of the things I tell them, and this may not be useful for you, but it might be, is that we know that people can have a heart attack. So a brain can, you know, a heart can suddenly stop working. The wiring kind of has a sort of meltdown. And one of the ways of thinking about suicide is that it's a heart attack of the brain. It's like there's a firestorm in the brain, and all the kind of neurons kind of break. And that's what led to the suicide. And I don't know if that would be helpful for you, but I really encourage you to get support, to get the support that will help you through this, as well as from your family and friends. And I'm so sorry this has happened to you.
Thank you, Julia. And this question is so poignant. Why do I feel so angry? Why have I not been able to cry about the 5 deaths I've experienced? And I love them so much.
Whoa. 5. That's so many. So I define anger as an expression of hurt, that it's like, ow, you're hurting me. We're wired to be angry to protect ourselves. So fear is the anticipation of hurt, like, oh no, you're going to hurt me. And anger is, stop, you're hurting me. And it's a natural, healthy response when we come under threat. And you've had 5 people that you're close to, the significant deaths. Of course you're angry. But of course, feeling angry is less sort of societally accepted than sadness. I think particularly for women. I've assumed it's a woman. I think it's a woman. But you know, people can kind of come beside you when you're sad and hold your hand, well, in the past, and give you cups of tea and soup. And when you're angry, it's a kind of bad design of us as human beings, because what we need most when we're angry is people to come towards us and hold us and allow us to be angry. But actually, people tend to step away from us and leave us more isolated and tell us not to be angry. And that increases our anger. And we kind of feel more and more angry and more enraged, really. And then there's low-level anger that sort of contaminates every feeling. On my Instagram, I've just done a tool that helps people with anger. So I'm not going to go into that now, but maybe you could go and have a look at that, because there's about 5 steps that you can do that can support you to diminish the level of anger you feel. But your anger is legitimate. It's not wrong having anger. It's just finding ways to help yourself express it and support yourself so it doesn't do harm to you and in the ways that you are with other people and the choices you make in your life.
Thank you, Julia. And I think we've got time just for one last question. And we've actually had 2 people ask about this, which is around sort of staying motivated and concentrating. So I'll just read this one. My question is, do you have any tips for dealing with immediate grief, which is manifesting as finding it hard to concentrate, feeling a bit sick, not wanting to really talk about it, and crying if someone is nice to me? I have so much that I'm responsible for, both at work and at home. I'm a single mum, got no other siblings, my parents have dementia, and I've got a busy job as a doctor. I've pre-warned people at work already not to ask me about it so that it's easier, and I tried to busy myself with work yesterday, but then her face pops up in my mind, and I think about her not being there at Christmas, or when I need to make a decision about our parents, or just to bounce ideas off, and I feel so empty and sad. I'm a very resilient and positive woman normally, and I'm finding this really tough going.
Well, I mean, it is tough going because it is tough going. I mean, you're managing an unmanageable amount of work and family and loss. And so, I mean, it's amazing that you've kept your job. And grief is embodied. So our mind and our body are completely interconnected. So every thought that you have will give you a visceral physiological expression in the body, and every feeling you have in your body will give you a thought. So the two are kind of completely aligned, and you are hurting right now because you're grieving. And I mean, I think one of the difficulties for you is that grief kind of deserves time, a bit like we're doing today. It deserves space to, Gary talked about it this morning, Gary Andrews. He's had time to think about and remember his wife, that in some way who died, has felt companionable, and it's been cathartic for him and healing for him. When you have no time, when you're living in the speed that you're living, doing so much for other people, your grief is like punching through and getting into your mind. And it would be anyway, because grief is its own master, and it comes in waves and it comes and gets you. But if you can do anything to create space for yourself, like get help to support your children or take your children for a walk, to give you little moments of time, even if it's short time, half an hour, where you can have space to remember, to feel, to journal, to connect, to be sad, to be angry, all of those things, and to intentionally calm yourself and soothe yourself and allow yourself some self-support that you're doing to everybody else. And maybe, people talk about micro habits. Even 5 minutes of a breathing in for 7 and out for 11 might calm you down, because it sounds like your whole system is in 4th gear. So you need to find little small micro steps to lower your system, because when you're in 4th gear, you can't concentrate. Your prefrontal cortex goes offline, so your memory is shot. And so the more you can find ways to take you from 4th gear to 1st gear, that will give you a way to connect to yourself and connect to others and actually connect to your memory. But love is strong medicine. It's the connection to others that you need most, where you own your vulnerability. And in expressing your vulnerability, you'll receive empathy from others and the connection that you need, which will help you heal. But for that, it's an intention. You have to make the time for it. And that's hard to do when there's so much on your shoulders.
Julia, thank you so much. Every time we speak, I learn something new, and I'm so impressed and touched by your wisdom and your sharing and compassion. So thank you so much for your time today.
I feel very, very honoured to be part of today. And, there are many people that won't agree with what I've said, and maybe that will clarify what they do need for themselves. And I suppose my wish most is that people allow themselves and give themselves permission to get the love and connection, to get the support that they need to help manage this incredibly difficult time, and that we actually do come together to make that happen in small ways and big ways. I hope
think
we
that's
can do that.
I think that's a really great place to end. So thank you so much, Julia. Please check out Julia Samuel's Instagram page for more practical tips and wisdom on grief. And I hope you all have a gentle day and that you found some solace in the session today. Thank you all.